The wind moved like an invisible hand through the high ridges of Colorado, shaking the crowns of the pines and scattering their needles across a lonely dirt road. Snow lingered only in small silver patches where sunlight could not reach, and the air smelled faintly of resin and ash. It was late afternoon when James Porter arrived at the cabin, a modest wooden structure half sunk into the hill, its windows clouded with dust, its porch sagging like an old soldier's back after years of standing guard. James was 43, his body broad-shouldered and strong, but marked by years of service. His hair, once black, was now streaked with gray around the temples. The stubble on his jaw was coarse, peppered with silver, and his eyes, a muted green, carried the distant, wary calm of someone who had watched too many horizons burn. There was a faint scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, a gift from the desert he no longer wished to remember. He had been a signal specialist in the army, the kind of man who could read storms in static and enemy movements in the flicker of a radar. But the last explosion had left him with a faint ringing in his right ear, a constant whisper that followed him into sleep and back again. It wasn't pain that haunted him, but the silence that came afterward. His truck stopped in front of the cabin. The engine sighed and died. James stayed still for a moment, hands resting on the wheel, staring at the slanting light cutting through the trees. From the passenger seat came a soft huff. Echo, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat and eyes the color of old whiskey. Echo's ears twitched at every creak and flutter outside, a soldier's instinct sharpened by years beside his master. His muzzle had started to gray, but there was still a power in his frame. Lean muscle, steady gait, an alert intelligence that seemed to listen even when the world held its breath. "Looks like home, partner," James murmured. His voice was low and rough, carrying the dry rasp of someone who had spent years talking over engines and gunfire. Echo's tail gave a slow wag, cautious but loyal. Together they stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The cabin had been listed by a small real estate company tied to the government, sold as is for a price so low it almost felt like charity. "Government liquidation property," the listing had said. To James, that meant paperwork forgotten, ghosts ignored. It was perfect. He wanted no neighbors, no visits, no questions. Just quiet. Inside, the air was cold but not musty. Dust floated through the slanted light that came from the single window. The furniture was simple: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed to the corner, and a fireplace made of stone, darkened by years of soot. On the far end stood a radio, large and old-fashioned, its casing made of oak, its knobs dulled by time. James set his duffel on the table and began to move with a methodical rhythm, checking windows, testing locks, inspecting the walls for drafts. He did this not from fear, but habit. Soldiers rarely stopped scanning for exits. Echo followed, sniffing corners, tail raised, mapping the new terrain with quiet precision. As night approached, the mountains grew darker, the pines whispering like a congregation of old men. James lit a fire and warmed a can of stew over the flame. Echo lay near the hearth, ears still twitching even in rest. Outside, the wind deepened, carrying the occasional crack of ice breaking from branches. James ate slowly, his mind wandering back to places he didn't speak of. Outposts buried in sand, voices calling over radio static, orders that blurred the line between duty and survival. He'd promised himself Colorado would be different. Here, the static would finally fade. When the clock struck 9, he cleaned the dishes and prepared to sleep. The house was so quiet that he could hear the faint hum of the generator outside, and beneath it, the steady rhythm of Echo's breathing. That sound grounded him, as if the dog's calm heart could steady his own. Then, a noise. It was soft at first, a crackle, A buzz, the unmistakable hiss of static. James opened his eyes. The room was dark except for the orange flicker of the fire, now dying to embers. Echo was already awake, standing, head turned sharply toward the wooden table. The radio. It had turned on by itself. Its amber dial glowed faintly. Out of the static came a voice, muffled, distorted, but distinctly human. "No one must know. Send the recording immediately." The words were clipped, urgent, military in tone. Then the static deepened, swallowed the voice, and fell silent. James froze. His pulse quickened, but his mind stayed calm, instinct taking over. He moved toward the table, careful not to make the floorboards creak. Echo growled, low and steady, the kind of growl that came from memory, trained to warn, not panic. James switched the dial off. Nothing. The power light dimmed. The cabin fell into full silence again. He waited a minute longer, hand resting on the wood, listening for movement outside. Nothing but wind and pine needles scraping the window. He exhaled, slow. "Just feedback," he muttered, though he didn't quite believe it. Feedback doesn't sound like orders. Echo continued to stare at the radio, ears pinned back, hackles raised slightly. He didn't bark now, just stared. It was that stillness, the kind animals hold when they sense something unseen, that made James's skin tighten. He crouched beside the dog, hand resting on its neck. "Easy, boy. It's just static." The words were meant for both of them. The rest of the night stretched long. James didn't sleep much. He lay on the bed, eyes open to the ceiling, listening for the faintest hum. Once, around midnight, he thought he heard the click of the radio again. But when he looked, the room was dark, and Echo still lay watching the four shadows. At dawn, sunlight crept through the blinds. The forest outside looked peaceful again. Deceptively so. The world had reset itself, pretending nothing had happened. James made coffee, poured some water into Echo's bowl, and stepped onto the porch. Mist hung low over the trees, curling between trunks like smoke. He told himself he would check the wiring later. Perhaps the generator had sent a surge, or some old circuit was misfiring. But as he sipped the bitter coffee, he noticed something odd. The plug of the radio's cord was unplugged from the wall socket. Completely. He stared at it for a long time. Behind him, Echo sat by the doorway, watching him in silence. The dog's head tilted slightly, ears half raised, as if waiting for an explanation. James forced a laugh, though it came out hollow. "Guess we've got ourselves a haunted appliance, huh?" Echo didn't move. His gaze was fixed not on James, but on the dark window of the cabin, where the reflection of the two of them looked back like ghosts caught in their own photograph. Later that day, James tried to shake it off. He fixed a broken hinge, chopped wood, and unpacked his few belongings: a worn photograph of his unit, an old army compass, and a notebook filled with half-written thoughts he never finished. Yet through every small task, his mind returned to that voice. No one must know. That night, he left the radio unplugged, set on the far end of the table, facing the wall. But when darkness came and the fire burned low again, Echo lifted his head, ears pricking toward it, and began to growl once more. James's heart sank. He hadn't even heard it yet, but he knew. The faint crackle of static was back. Thin, almost shy, like someone whispering through the bones of the house. And then came the voice again, clearer this time, trembling through the static like a secret carried on the wind. "Repeat transmission. Confirm delivery. Code black." James's hand tightened around the flashlight. Echo took a step forward, silent but alert, every muscle ready. The voice faded. Silence filled the cabin again, heavy, knowing, alive. James turned to his dog, his own voice a whisper. "What the hell did we just walk into?" Outside, the pines swayed. Inside, the radio sat motionless, unplugged, its dial dark. But James knew what he had heard. And somewhere deep in the house's quiet heart, Echo's ears stayed raised, as if listening for the next breath from the unseen speaker. The days that followed blurred together beneath the restless sighs of the pine forest. Snow came lightly at first, dusting the porch and the roof of the old truck, then melted under the weak sun, leaving the earth damp and the air full of that cold, metallic scent of winter waiting its turn. Inside the cabin, James Porter tried to pretend that life was normal again. He spent the mornings splitting wood, the afternoons walking along the ridge, and the evenings in front of the fireplace, watching Echo sleep beside him. But every night, every single night at midnight, the radio turned itself on. Always the same sound, always the same time. A soft hum, a flicker of light, and a voice like breath over broken wires. At first, James ignored it. He turned the radio to face the wall, unplugged it again, even removed the batteries from the small backup slot he hadn't noticed before. But it didn't matter. When the clock struck the same minute, the amber glow returned. Sometimes it was only static, sometimes a faint conversation, murmurs that faded as soon as he reached for it. Echo always knew first. The shepherd would rise from sleep, ears erect, tail low, eyes fixed on the dark box as if it were alive. On the third night, James gave up pretending. He laid his tools across the table, a small screwdriver set, his army-issued flashlight, a folding knife, and began to take the radio apart. The casing came away with a reluctant creak, as if it didn't want to give up its secrets. Beneath the dust lay something stranger than simple machinery. There, built into the base, was a second compartment, soldered shut with precision that was anything but domestic. He pried it open carefully, the metal snapping with a dull click. Inside was a small recording module, old and delicate, wrapped in brittle waxed paper. Faint lettering on its casing read, "Property of U.S. Intelligence, 1973. A corner bore the faded outline of the CIA insignia. James stared at it for a long time, the cold creeping into his fingers despite the fire. "Jesus," he whispered. Echo let out a low whine, brushing against his leg. The dog's fur smelled faintly of smoke and pine sap. James ran a hand through it absently, his mind unraveling the implications. A listening post? A surveillance relay? But why here, in this forgotten mountain cabin? And why was it still alive? He pulled the old tape from the device, pocketed it, and reassembled the radio. For the first time, he didn't sleep at all. The next day, clouds rolled in heavy and gray, blanketing the valley in stillness. James tried to busy himself by repairing the porch steps, though his mind wasn't with the hammer. He kept glancing toward the cabin, half expecting the radio to be glowing again, even in daylight. Around noon, the distant growl of an approaching vehicle snapped him back. He stepped off the porch, squinting down the narrow road. A rust-colored pickup came crawling up the incline, its bed, full of supplies and lumber. The driver was Calvin Dorsey, a man in his late 50s with skin weathered by sun and wind, his hands broad and cracked from years of labor. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes a sharp pale blue that missed little. Calvin was the nearest neighbor, 3 miles east, past the frozen creek, and he had the slow, deliberate speech of mountain folk who measured words like nails before using them. "Mornin', stranger," he said, voice carrying the dry rasp of cigarettes and cold air. "Heard someone bought the Miller place. Didn't expect it to be a soldier." "Ex-soldier," James corrected, offering a handshake. "James Porter." Calvin's grip was strong. "Dorsey, Calvin, I do a bit of hauling for folks out this way. You'll find it quiet up here." He paused, studying the cabin. "Maybe too quiet for some." James gave a small nod, unsure how to answer. Echo, sitting beside him, watched the man intently, tail still. Calvin smiled faintly at the dog. "Fine shepherd you got there. Looks like he listens better than most men." "He does," James said, with a trace of a smile. The man nodded once, then shifted his weight. "You holler if you need anything. These woods have long memories. The Miller boy built this place back in the 70s, worked with some federal survey or something. Folks say he left in a hurry. Never came back." James's jaw tightened slightly. "He leave a radio behind?" Calvin frowned, caught off guard by the question. "That old thing?" "Yeah, I reckon it's been there since Carter was president. Strange, though. My pa used to say some nights, when the snow fell just right, you could hear voices through the wind. Government testing, they called it." He gave a short laugh, though it didn't sound amused. "Guess you'll have yourself some company after all." When the man drove away, the sound of his truck faded quickly into the hush of the woods. James went back inside, Echo following close. He looked at the radio again. "Company," he muttered. "Yeah." That evening, Echo became restless. The dog paced near the fireplace, claws clicking softly on the wooden floor. Then he began to scratch at the far corner, where the baseboard met the hearth. James frowned. "What is it, boy?" Echo scratched harder, whining now, the fur along his neck bristling. James set the poker aside, knelt down, and tapped the floorboards. A hollow echo answered back. Carefully, he pried up the loose plank. Beneath it lay a narrow compartment, lined with dust and cobwebs. Inside was a small reel of magnetic tape, the kind used in field recorders decades ago. Its label, half torn, read only 2 words: Operation Ashfield. James turned it over in his hands. The tape felt fragile, almost sacred. He carried it to the table, cleared a space, and set up the old recorder he had found earlier. Echo sat beside him, silent now, eyes fixed on the device as if he understood the gravity of what was coming. He pressed play. The tape hissed for a long moment, then 2 voices emerged. Faint, male, professional. "Target secured. Orders remain unchanged." "Sir, the situation's unstable. There are civilians on site. Collateral is collateral. Proceed." The second voice, steady, weary, but tinged with defiance, was unfamiliar. The first, however, made James's blood run cold. It was deep, precise, and carried that clipped authority he had once obeyed without question. "This operation exceeds its bounds," the second voice said again, this time quieter. "We're crossing a line." "No one leaves alive," the first replied. The tape clicked, then stopped. James sat back, staring at the recorder. Echo whined softly. The fire popped in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney. "Grant," James whispered. His throat was dry. "Grant Holloway." The name felt like rust in his mouth. Grant had been his commanding officer, a tall, angular man with silver hair even in his 40s, a reputation for brilliance shadowed by rumor. To the public now, he was a philanthropist and CEO, a polished face on the evening news who spoke about progress, security, and the promise of a safer world. But James remembered another Grant, the one who had sent young men into doomed missions, who smiled when the reports came back incomplete. Later that night, James turned on the small television he'd brought with him, catching the local news station through a haze of static. And there he was, Grant Holloway, standing at a podium beneath the seal of a corporate giant called Holloway Dynamics. The camera lights gleamed against his tailored suit, his jaw clean-shaven, his smile rehearsed. "We at Holloway Dynamics believe in rebuilding trust," he said, his voice smooth and familiar as it filled the cabin. "Our mission is to protect the future." James stared at the screen. The voice was identical to the one on the tape, the same rhythm, the same cold conviction. Echo growled softly, his fur rising. The veteran turned off the TV. For a long time he sat there, fingers pressed to his temples. The cabin was quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the quiet of a place holding its breath. He looked at the floor, at the dark hollow where the tape had been hidden. The boards around it seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, as if the house itself remembered. "This wasn't a home," James said under his breath. "It was a listening post." Echo lifted his head, eyes reflecting the firelight. The dog gave a single low bark, sharp and certain as though to confirm what James already knew. Whatever this place had been, it wasn't finished speaking yet. By the fifth night, the sky above the valley had turned the color of gunmetal. The wind carried a warning before the first flakes even fell. A long, distant howl rolling down from the peaks. James Porter sat at his table, laptop open, the dim glow of its screen casting sharp shadows across the walls. Echo lay nearby, head resting on his paws, watching his master with steady eyes. The cabin creaked under the pressure of the approaching storm. On the screen, the small progress bar reached the end. The file was uploading, a digital copy of the tape labeled Operation Ashfield. It had taken hours to clean and convert, his old military software grinding through layers of noise until the voices became clear. When it finished, he sent the encrypted folder to Mark Jensen, the only man he trusted enough to handle it. Mark had once shared a tent with him in a dust-blown base in Kandahar. Back then, he was a combat correspondent, a tall, lean man with wind-chapped skin and a face made for squinting through sandstorms. His eyes were quick, brown, and tired, the kind that had seen too much death to believe in glory. After the war, Mark turned to investigative journalism, chasing stories that most networks refused to touch. Now in his late 40s, his black hair had gone iron gray at the sides, and his smile, when it appeared, carried more sadness than warmth. James typed carefully, his fingers stiff from the cold. "Mark, I found something buried up here. It involves Holloway. You'll know what to do. Encrypt this twice. Burn the copies." He hit send and waited. The wind screamed outside, rattling the windows. Echo lifted his head, ears flicking toward the door. A few minutes later, the laptop buzzed. A message back. "Jesus, James, this voice. It's him. Are you sure you want to dig this deep? If that's Holloway, you're walking into the kill zone. Lock your doors. And for God's sake, don't trust anyone in uniform." James stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Then he shut the laptop and sat in the flicker of the fire, listening to the snow begin to fall. The storm hit that night, a wall of white swallowing the valley. By morning, the world was muffled under 2 feet of snow. James spent the day sealing windows, stacking firewood, keeping busy to avoid the gnawing unease inside him. Every so often he would glance toward the radio, now silent, its face turned to the wall like a scolded child. It was close to midnight when Echo began to growl. The sound started low in his chest and built slowly until it became a deep rumble that vibrated through the wooden floor. James set down his mug, listening. The wind had died. No more creaking of branches or sighing pines, just a strange, heavy silence that felt unnatural. Then, through the frost-clouded window, he saw them. Headlights, 2 beams cutting through the curtain of snow, growing brighter as they climbed the narrow trail to the cabin. The vehicle came into view. A black SUV, its surface shining with sleet, windows tinted dark, no license plates. James moved quickly, dousing the fire and flipping off the lamp. The cabin plunged into shadow. Echo stood rigid by the door, tail straight, ready. Moments later, heavy footsteps crunched outside. A fist hammered the wood. "Mr. Porter," a voice called, smooth but carrying authority. "We're with Federal Asset Recovery. We're here to retrieve classified property found on government land." James didn't answer. His heartbeat drummed in his ears. Another voice joined the first, deeper and more impatient. "Sir, open up. We don't want to damage the door. This is official business." Official business. That phrase hit him harder than the cold. He recognized the rhythm. The precise, rehearsed tone used by men who didn't need badges to be obeyed. James signaled to Echo with a hand gesture. Silent, precise. A command they both remembered from years of raids. The shepherd moved behind the sofa, invisible in the darkness. The first kick splintered the latch. The second burst the door open. Two figures entered, both large men in dark winter coats, faces half-shadowed by fur-lined hoods. Snow whirled in behind them. One held a flashlight, the other something heavier. A sidearm, barely concealed. James raised his voice from the corner, calm but cold. "You're not from any agency I know." The man with the flashlight swung the beam toward him. He had a square face, close-cropped hair, and the thick neck of a man who spent more time in a gym than an office. His partner was older, bald under his hood, his mouth drawn tight in permanent irritation. Both moved like trained professionals, measured, cautious. "Mr. Porter," the bald one said, "you have something that belongs to us. Hand it over, and this ends quietly." James took a slow breath. "You want proof? Listen." He reached for the small speaker connected to his laptop and hit play. The cabin filled with the ghostly crackle of the tape, then the unmistakable voice of Grant Holloway. "No one leaves alive. Burn everything." The sound froze them where they stood. Even the younger man's flashlight wavered. "Where the hell did you get that?" the bald one hissed. "From under my floor," James said. "And now half the world will have it soon." The younger man's expression twisted. "You shouldn't have done that." He raised his gun. Echo exploded from the shadows, a flash of gray and muscle. The dog hit the man's legs like a storm, teeth sinking into his arm. The pistol fired once, the shot tearing into the ceiling. The man screamed, trying to wrench free, but Echo's jaws held fast. James dove for the fallen flashlight, swung it into the bald man's temple. The man stumbled, dropping his own weapon. The room became chaos, snow, shouting, and the desperate bark of Echo defending his home. Then came the hiss of something landing on the floor. A small metal canister, rolled across the planks, spinning to a stop near the table. Gas. James grabbed Echo by the collar and dragged him toward the back of the house. Smoke filled the air, thick and oily, making his eyes sting. Behind him, one of the men shouted, "Light it!" James's lungs burned. He yanked open the trap door leading to the crawl space, half blinded, half running. Echo slipped through first, growling as fire flared somewhere above. James dropped down after him, pulling the hatch closed just as the cabin erupted in a roar. Heat punched through the floorboards. The air turned red. They crawled through the narrow maintenance tunnel that led beneath the foundation, a path James had found days ago while repairing pipes. The smoke followed them, choking, relentless. Echo coughed, a sound more like a whimper than a bark. James pressed a hand against his side, urging him forward. At last, they burst through a rusted vent into the snow outside. The cold hit them like a shock, a rebirth. Behind them, the cabin was ablaze, the flames towering against the white storm, devouring the roof and spilling black smoke into the sky. James stumbled into the tree line, lungs raw, watching the inferno consume everything he owned. Echo limped beside him, panting hard. Then, from the corner of his eye, James saw movement, the dog nosing through the snow, digging frantically near where they had crawled out. His teeth caught something. A small metal box, soot-streaked but intact. The same container that had once held the tapes. Echo carried it to James, dropping it at his boots before collapsing in exhaustion. James knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's trembling side. "You saved it," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Good boy. Damn good boy." The wind rose again, scattering ash and snow together until it was impossible to tell them apart. The cabin was gone, but the truth had survived, clutched in the jaws of a loyal friend. James stood, box in hand, eyes reflecting the fire's last glow. "They think it ends here," he murmured, "but they're wrong." Echo lifted his head weakly, and in that brief glance, half man, half animal, they both understood. The hunt had only just begun. The snow had not stopped falling, but it had changed its nature. It no longer fell like a curtain meant to hide, but like ash descending after something had burned away. For 3 days and nights, James Porter and Echo lived deep within the timber line, sheltered beneath a narrow rock overhang. The air inside smelled of pine and smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the melted snow James used to wash the blood from Echo's paw. The shepherd's fur was dull with soot, his ribs showing slightly under the thick coat, yet his eyes were still alive, steady, amber, and watchful. James was worse off. Exhaustion lined his face, and his stubble had turned into a full, rough beard streaked with gray. His hands were chapped, knuckles split open from the cold. Still, when the small radio clipped to his vest crackled and Mark's voice whispered through the static, something in him came back to life. "You made it out?" Mark asked, his tone tight with worry. James pressed the button and answered in a low rasp. "Barely. They burned the place. I have what matters." "Good. Then get moving. I'm 2 towns east. A motel called Crescent Pines, off Highway 12. Room 9. The line went dead. When they finally reached the town, the snow had turned to sleet. The place was small, a scattering of gas stations, diners, and tired storefronts strung along a single road. It was the kind of town people drove through without remembering its name. James parked the truck he'd stolen from an abandoned ranger station behind the motel, a squat building with a faded neon sign buzzing weakly against the night. Inside room 9, Mark Jensen looked older than James remembered. He was tall and wiry, his skin weathered and pale from years behind screens and under artificial lights. His hair, once dark, was now more silver than black, brushed back carelessly. The fine lines around his eyes were cut deep from squinting at too many screens, too many truths that people didn't want to hear. A faint tremor touched his fingers as he adjusted his glasses, though whether it came from nerves or caffeine was impossible to tell. When James entered, Echo close behind, Mark exhaled in visible relief. "Jesus, you look like hell," he said, stepping forward. "I've seen worse," James replied. He dropped the metal box onto the table with a metallic thud. "It's all here." Mark knelt beside Echo, scratching gently behind his ear. "You kept him alive, huh?" The dog leaned into the touch, tail giving one tired wag. "More like he kept me alive," James said. They spent the next hours in silence, except for the hum of Mark's laptop and the soft tapping of keys. James sat on the bed, watching the reflection of code scroll across the window. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass like a living thing. Mark muttered to himself, running decryption programs, bypassing layers of hidden data. "Whoever set this up didn't want anyone finding it," he said. "They failed," James replied. By dawn, their work was done. 3 copies of the files, encrypted, watermarked, and scheduled for automatic release, had been uploaded to separate servers linked to major news outlets and 1 independent congressional office. Mark slumped back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. It's out of our hands now. Once these go live, there's no taking them back. James nodded, though the weight of it pressed down on him. What's in there? It's not just Holloway, is it? Mark looked up, his expression grim. No, it's bigger. There are names you wouldn't believe. Politicians, generals, private contractors, all profiting off black operations that never existed on paper. He hesitated, studying James's face. You sure you're ready for what happens next? James gave a hollow laugh. Ready stopped mattering a long time ago. For 4 days, they stayed hidden. News trickled in first as rumors, then as full-blown headlines. Classified audio exposes covert operations linked to Holloway Dynamics. Anchors stammered through summaries they barely understood. Whistleblower networks exploded online. Holloway himself appeared on television once, his face pale, his usual composure fractured. He denied everything, of course, but his eyes, cold, calculating, betrayed a flicker of fear. Mark was the one who brought the newspaper to James's motel room. The headline read, Senate Committee launches investigation into Holloway's secret campaign. James read it once, then folded the paper carefully. It's out there now. Mark poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands still trembling slightly. You realize what you've done, right? You just forced the truth into daylight. You're not a ghost anymore, James. You're the man who made the ghosts talk. James stared out the window at the wet snow turning to slush on the pavement. He didn't answer. Echo was asleep near the heater, one paw twitching as he dreamed. The rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the small room. They didn't see the black sedan until noon the next day. It rolled slowly past the motel, windows tinted, the kind of government-issued car that didn't belong anywhere so small. James saw it first, and felt that old pulse of alertness return. He stepped away from the window. We've been found. Mark froze. Are you sure? They move like professionals, James said quietly. They're not here to talk. Mark closed the laptop, packed the drives, and handed one to James. Separate routes. If they get me, you keep moving. I have backups online, dead man switches on timers. If I don't log in, everything goes public again. Mark, don't argue. You're the soldier. I'm the messenger. We both know who survives longer. The look they shared in that moment said everything. Gratitude, resignation, and a bond forged long before this fight. Mark managed a thin smile. Tell the world I wasn't paranoid. James almost smiled back. You were, just not enough. By the time the sedan parked outside, James and Echo were already gone, slipping out the rear exit into the alley behind the motel. The world had turned gray again. Wet snow, gray sky, gray buildings blending into anonymity. He didn't look back until they reached the outskirts of town. That evening, when his prepaid phone vibrated, James answered on the first ring. It was Mark's voice, low but steady. It's done. 3 major outlets confirmed authenticity. Holloway's under federal review. The recordings are on every network. James said nothing for a long time. The wind outside the truck windows carried the faint hum of a radio from a nearby diner. Voices repeating his story, without knowing his name. Mark's voice cracked slightly, emotion bleeding through. You did it, James. You turned the static into something people can hear. James looked at Echo curled beside him, the dog's reflection caught in the rearview mirror. Those same amber eyes, calm but still alert. We did it, he said softly. And it's not over yet. In the distance, the first light of dawn touched the mountains, melting the frost that clung to the trees. Echo lifted his head, ears perked toward the sound of morning traffic, a world moving again after a long silence. James rested a hand on his companion's back, feeling the warmth beneath the fur, the steady rise and fall of breath. "Rest, old friend," he murmured. "You've earned it." Echo blinked slowly, then lay his head back down, but his ears stayed half raised, as if the dog still listened to something only he could hear. The world outside was full of noise again, news, outrage, and 1,000 voices talking over one another. But in that quiet cabin of the mind where James once lived, there was finally peace. Spring came late to the Colorado highlands that year. Snow still clung to the shaded edges of the valley, reluctant to leave, while the meltwater carved new streams through the blackened ruins of what had once been James Porter's cabin. The forest had changed. The silence was different now. Not haunted, not watching. Just quiet, the kind that came after something terrible had finally finished speaking. James parked his truck at the foot of the old path and stepped out slowly, his boots sinking into damp moss. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine needles and ash. His beard was shorter now, trimmed but still rough. Months of healing had left faint pink lines on his temple and forearms, marks from the night his world burned. He was leaner, calmer, but there was still that soldier's stillness about him, the way he scanned the tree line without even thinking. Echo bounded ahead, tail low but wagging, his gait slightly uneven from the injury he'd taken that night. Time had brushed a softer gray along his muzzle, but his eyes, amber and intelligent, remained steady. James had seen doctors patch men up from worse, but somehow Echo had healed faster than either of them should have. Maybe dogs carried forgiveness better than humans ever could. They reached what was left of the cabin, only the stone foundation and a scatter of charred beams. The fireplace had survived, blackened but standing. James ran his hand along the soot-darkened stones, feeling the cold that lived beneath the surface. "We made it back, boy," he murmured. Echo sniffed around the rubble, nose twitching. He circled once, twice, then trotted to the edge of the clearing where the ground sloped toward the creek. He paused there, ears perked, tail stiff. Then he began to dig. James watched for a moment before walking over. "What is it now?" he asked softly, kneeling beside the shepherd. Echo's paws scraped at the earth, dislodging stones and damp leaves until something metallic glinted in the sunlight. James brushed away the dirt. A small USB drive, the casing scratched but intact. His breath caught. He remembered it, the emergency backup he'd buried weeks before everything went to hell. He hadn't told anyone, not even Mark. He'd hidden it for insurance, a soldier's instinct to keep a second exit ready. And somehow, Echo had remembered the scent of his hands when he buried it. "Good memory," James whispered, taking the drive gently. He smiled, faint but real. He sat down on a fallen beam and pulled a small solar-powered reader from his bag. The drive clicked into place, and the screen lit up. Inside were 2 folders, evidence and letters. The first he already knew, but the second... He hesitated, then opened it. They were written months earlier, during the chaos, messages he'd recorded and never sent. Some addressed to Mark Jensen, others to the families of the soldiers who'd vanished under Holloway's command. Words he hadn't been brave enough to send. Words like apologies, confessions, explanations no one had asked for. As he read, the wind moved through the trees above him, soft and rhythmic, like breathing. Echo lay at his feet, head resting on his paws, watching him quietly. A sound of footsteps made James look up. From the tree line, a woman emerged, tall, wrapped in a forest green coat, her auburn hair pulled back under a wool hat. Her name was Evelyn Carver, an FBI field agent who had worked on the Holloway investigation. She had a steady, composed walk, the kind of presence that carried both authority and fatigue. She looked to be in her mid-30s, fair-skinned but wind-burned from months in the mountains. Her blue eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Agent Carver," James greeted her. "You're far from Denver." "Not far enough," she said, stopping a few feet away. Her breath came out in white puffs. "I heard you were back up here." "Just tying loose ends." She looked around at the ruins, the snowmelt running between stones. "You know, they're calling you a hero now. Whistleblower, patriot, all that." James gave a small, humorless laugh. "Heroes don't burn down their own houses." She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "The Bureau's closing the file. Holloway's facing trial in D.C. His network's collapsed. Jensen's testimony sealed the case. We found your fingerprints in the metadata, though." "I didn't do it for them," James said quietly. "Just for the ones who didn't get a voice." Carver nodded once, slipping her hands into her coat pockets. "You ever think about what's next?" James looked at the forest. "I think about peace. Not the kind you fight for. The kind that comes when you stop fighting." She smiled faintly. "Then you're already ahead of most of us." She glanced down at Echo. "He's a good dog." "The best," James said. They stood in silence for a while. Then Carver took a step back. "Well, I should leave you to it. Just one thing, Porter. If you ever decide to disappear again, make sure it's somewhere warm this time." He almost smiled. "I'll keep that in mind." She turned, her boots crunching over the frost, and disappeared into the trees. James sat there a long while, the USB still in his hand. The forest was quiet except for the creek and the slow, patient tapping of melting ice. He reached into his pack and pulled out something else, a bent, half-melted radio, the same one that had first spoken to him months ago. Its dial was cracked, the casing warped, but when he set it on the stone ledge, it caught the sunlight in a strange, forgiving way. He looked at Echo. "Think she's gone for good this time?" Echo tilted his head, as if considering, then let out a single short bark. James chuckled softly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." He placed the radio on the foundation's highest stone, facing the forest, and stood back. The wind whispered through the trees again, almost like a voice answering him. "Now it's quiet," he said. "Truly quiet." The light faded toward evening. Shadows stretched across the valley, long and thin, until the ruins were just outlines in the dusk. Echo pressed against his leg, and together they watched the sky turn from gold to gray to the deep calm of night. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. He didn't hear ghosts in the static or the hum of hidden transmitters. The silence no longer frightened him. He rested his hand on Echo's back and whispered, "Come on, boy. Let's go home." The two of them walked down the trail, leaving behind the ashes of old secrets and the radio that would never speak again. In the distance, the forest sighed with wind and the faint sound of water. Nature's static, eternal and pure. And for James Porter and the shepherd, who had once listened to the ghosts of men, the silence that followed was not emptiness, but peace. In the end, James learned that silence was never the absence of sound. It was the presence of something greater. Somewhere between fire and forgiveness, he realized that miracles don't always arrive as thunder or light. Sometimes they come as a whisper, carried on the wind, reminding us that God never truly leaves those who listen. In our own lives, when the world feels loud with fear and confusion, may we find that same stillness, the quiet faith that light will return, and that no truth stays buried forever. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to join us in more tales of faith, courage, and redemption. May God bless and protect everyone who watches, and may His grace guide you through the storms toward peace.